Hi, I am Roberto. In this video, I present to you a conversation that I had with the researcher in psychology Keegan Knittle. He's a researcher from the University of Helsinki in Finland. And yeah, he specializes in motivation and behavior change, and he has done that in multiple areas such as physical activity, but also for populations with chronic conditions. And specifically in this conversation, we spoke about a very interesting study that he and his colleagues conducted, which was published under the title The Compendium of Self-enactable Techniques to Change and Self-Manage Motivation and Behavior, version 1.0. So this paper is very recent, it's from 2020, and it's not only recent, but it's also quite interesting. So as a short introduction, just ask yourself, have you ever been in that situation where you wish to make a change in your life, and when you want to change something but you don't know how to start? It could be either picking up a good habit or removing a bad one. And that's the key moment where we don't know really what the first step should be. And what the compendium does is that it helps us through that process. So what Keegan Knittle and his colleagues did was actually make a collection of 123 techniques that we can use and experiment with to basically control and manage our own behavior. So just so you know, there are many things that are important in the way that this work was developed, that this compendium was built. Because first of all, they took a look at many other taxonomies, which in science are ways of classifying techniques to change behavior. And they also did that with a very interesting open science approach. And the important thing about that is that they even have a general version to the public. So anybody can just look at this information and try to use it for their own case. Now, like I said, I think at least I managed to get you curious about this compendium. It's something that you can just get into it and try for yourself and start experimenting with behavior change. So here is my conversation with Keegan Knittle. I would like to start actually with you. Can you just maybe briefly provide a brief professional introduction about yourself and what you're doing right now?
Yeah, my name is Keegan Knittle. I'm a university researcher at the University of Helsinki. I've done a lot of work in developing behavior change interventions, specifically self-management type interventions for people with chronic illnesses, rheumatoid arthritis, type 2 diabetes, and for people at risk of developing non-communicable diseases, specifically type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. I've bounced around Europe since about 2006. I did my master's in Leiden University in the Netherlands and stayed there to do a PhD, and then did a postdoc in Newcastle University, and have since 2014 been here in Helsinki.
Nice.
Yeah, I met a lot of great people along the way. And
yeah, can I ask what are your kind of main professional interests? I mean, you have worked with different conditions, for example, but is it maybe self-management, or what are the key words of your?
so my keywords, I guess, in terms of the research I'm most interested in is motivation, and specifically I've done the most work in motivation for physical activity. I'm really curious how you can get someone who hasn't considered even changing their behavior to A, consider it, and B, take first steps toward changing. And that's something that's really overlooked. We have a lot of interventions and a lot of ways that we think we can motivate people to change behavior, which is good, and some of them do have effectiveness and can increase motivation. But most of these in research articles have been delivered to people who are already kind of motivated, in that they're signing up to take part in a study about physical activity motivation or about motivation more generally. So how can you reach the people who are more difficult to reach and get them motivated? It's quite clear, especially for physical activity, that the people who could most benefit from an intervention are the people least likely to join up to intervention. So bridging this gap between reaching the unreachable. Let me just put it that way.
Nice, interesting. And actually, maybe before I jump into the topic of the compendium, the article that you published in 2020,
I just want to ask also kind of if you want to say a bit of the personal aspect in all of this of motivation, because like I said, I have a similar interest, and I think it's always very useful when you kind of apply your own techniques and your own knowledge to yourself. Is that something that you have experienced, like also kind of the difficulty in that in your daily life, or how do you separate this? You know, what kind of scientific knowledge do you use for yourself?
That's really interesting. I
I mean,
have,
we're humans, right? We cannot always be super motivated. We're still
yeah,
human.
that's true. And I can't say that I always practice what I preach in that regard. I published this article on 123 different self-enactable techniques that people can use. And I've got to be honest, in real life, I've maybe used 20 of them. So
Yeah, yeah,
there's lots of room for me to further improve motivation
yeah,
where I see there need to be
yeah. No,
doing
that,
that. But
yeah,
one key thing about this compendium and this list is that the first thing we always ask people to do in it is to follow technique number one, agenda
yeah,
mapping,
yeah,
which is basically to choose what behavior you might consider managing or changing, and which behavior you might need a boost in motivation for.
yeah,
So if you haven't picked a behavior, or if you don't understand what behavior it is you want to change, the compendium isn't going to be much help. It's really for people who have an idea about a behavior they might want to change.
yeah. Yeah, actually, you know, that was one of the questions I had because, yeah, it was very clear, and also in the general version that you have of this companion, you provide these instructions, this introduction of key topics. I thought that was important, and then you say, yeah, that the first technique, agenda mapping, and then I think there are the second and third are also follow-ups that directly go after that, brainstorming, all of this. Yeah, yeah, you say this should be the start, and I was wondering. You know, I will agree that this is the ideal start. But as we know, I mean, a lot of theories, so for example, goal setting theory also points out the fact, and we know that sometimes the motivation comes from external incentives, right? Like, or some feedback, somebody gave you some input, like somebody points towards something, maybe not in the best manner, sometimes in good manners that you can improve. And you are, I think, a motivation expert. Is this, what are the consequences? Maybe you just explain it a bit, but really, what are the consequences of when someone starts behavior change or tries to change behavior by dealing with kind of, or starting with extrinsic input rather than a thoughtful consciousness? So you see, like, that could be leading to somewhere less effective in the long run.
Um, in the long run, it's hard to say,
Yeah,
but anything that gets somebody to consider,
yeah,
to openly consider what they might be willing to change or might be able to change, I think is a good step. Of course, if someone is trying to force another person to change their behavior, there's going to be resistance. The person is going to pull back. They're going to not want to listen to what the person is saying. And the reason for this is something within motivational interviewing that is a very, very common statement, is this notion of ambivalence. So if somebody has a behavior, say they could benefit from a change
yeah,
by making a change in that behavior, they probably know what they would gain if they changed, and they also know what they would gain if things stay the same.
yeah,
And if somebody is pushing them, say you need to change because of this and this and this reason, if someone external gives this other side of the argument, the person themselves fills in the other side of the argument.
yeah,
And just because all of that information is already in their head, and if they're hearing this, then they say, yeah, but there's also this. So according to self-perception theory of Daryl Bem, it's really not great in trying to change behavior when people are always themselves bringing forward the counter arguments to
mm,
change. So a better way to do that would be to ask people questions that might give this pro argument.
yeah,
Why would you make a change?
yeah,
What would be in it for you? To get them to say, here's the positives. So yeah, that's
yeah,
a really important way if you're trying to get someone to change their behavior to do it, to let them bring the positives and the pro-change arguments.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. And now I would like to address kind of also the origin of this work on the compendium. Can you talk a bit about how was this study originated? Was it connected to a larger project, or was it just somebody's ideas that, I mean, you talk a lot in the introduction of your article, of course, the other taxonomies that exist, but what was there like a specific point of origin that this work started to become developed?
So the idea for the study came from Professor Nelly Honkanen, who I work closely with, and she had published a couple of papers. I had also published a paper, which shows that, well, okay, let me back up. A lot of the techniques present within existing taxonomies, so a lot of behavior change techniques require somebody to take an action themselves. So if you tell the person to make an action plan, they have to actually make the action plan, and it has to be specific enough. And if you ask them to self-monitor their behavior, to keep track of their steps of physical activity per day, they have to actually take notes of this and actually keep track of it. And there's evidence that the greater extent to which people self-enact, actually use these techniques on their own, the more their behavior changes as a result, and the more that behavior is likely to be maintained in the longer term. So really putting in the effort in enacting these techniques is key to creating behavior change and keeping it going in the long term. And so, as I said, both Nelly and I had published papers that give some evidence to this notion. And yeah, Nelly had a brilliant idea to have an entire research project around these actions that people can themselves take. And this compendium was the first step in that direction.
Nice, thanks. And then I was wondering, I told you a bit before that, I mean, I was also, you could say, impressed about the choices that you made for not just the journal, but also the open science approach. I'm wondering if this was just, I mean, I think it will be normal and probably ideal that this is the way of working in modern science, or in a large part, I would say. Just to make things available. And I was also wondering about the general version that you made for the compendium. Was this all some kind of requirement that you adhere to, or was it something that was seen as necessary also because of the goal of the research?
Our research group operates almost strictly under open science principles. We think that it's crucial to having science that is replicable and open and clear and transparent. And everyone in our group at least recognizes that the replication crisis had put a damper on what we can say as psychologists and research psychologists, and has made us seem a little bit less trustworthy perhaps in the eyes of the general public. So we find it important to take steps to try and rectify that image. So we pre-register every study that we take part in, and make all materials and protocols and things open fully, generally through the open science framework, in addition to publishing preprints and those sort of things.
Was there a requirement, or is there a kind of, I don't know, like a bullet point or something to deliver general versions of the public, or was this only a specific input for this type of study, which, like I said, made sense to have this?
Yeah, that was just for this type of study. So the reason we have this version for the general public is when we did some interviews with people around some of the techniques. We had a student, Franziska Ebrecht, who was working on that. The interviews showed that people didn't understand some of the terms, and that they needed some sort of guidance to how to get started. They would look at the technique definitions and examples and not necessarily understand everything fully. So the idea of a glossary and introduction was just to get members of the general public up to speed, so to speak, with how they might use this compendium and what it might mean for them.
Yeah, thanks. I definitely thought it was interesting to do it that way. And I will imagine that most scientific articles could have this kind of version, maybe in some way, right? But yeah, I think it was nice to have it also, especially in this topic. I was wondering then, my next question was, how difficult, or maybe it was already there, Was it to arrive at the term self-enaction or self-enactable? Because I see in the article, for example, you also use self-deploy. I mean, which I think could be some kind of a synonym. Was it difficult to arrive at this, or was it already done also in previous works?
We had a lot of discussion about what we would actually call these things. We had agentic actions, so actions that people could themselves take to be agents. We had self-help techniques. We had self-management techniques, but we really wanted to get at the core of the enactment, the actual doing of something, and yeah, that's how we landed on that. There was we also took some time in trying to find the name. Yeah. So we had, so there's 123 techniques in the name, or in the compendium, and we had gone for 123 agentic behavior change actions. So 1, 2, 3 ABC was one original version. Another one was the list of self-help intervention techniques, the shit list. And that one,
this was very brainstormy, I guess.
Yeah, that one was pretty good, and I think we had Jenny McSherry visiting our group, and I think she came up with that idea.
Oh, that's very interesting.
But in the end, yeah, one of our co-authors, Marguerite Beatty, had the idea of like a compilation, like sort of like a mixtape that you would make for your friend and give them a compilation of things, and comp, and then I came up with compendium, and that's where we landed.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, I mean, because other kind of lists are named as taxonomies, right? And taxonomy it has a definition of its own, but compendium, I thought, yeah, it does show a bit more practicality about it.
Yeah, and we didn't come up with any new techniques on our own. The idea was we're compiling these things from different sources, and that's where we landed.
I mean, you already mentioned a bit about the the initial techniques, and that you collected all of these from different taxonomies. I was wondering, because I mean, you took a look at different taxonomies. Some of them, honestly, I didn't even know. I of course knew Mickey's group, like the BBCT, that is widely used now, and I know the intervention mapping a bit. But you even, I think, found or knew and used a lot of others. Was there any taxonomy that was kind of striking to you in terms of it stood out from what the others were doing?
Not particularly. So another one that we used was from sort of classifying techniques that would be used in motivational interviewing. And so if you're giving a motivational interview to someone, there's always like a therapist or a counselor or somebody giving the motivational interview to someone else. So that doesn't necessarily lend itself to self-enactment. But a few of those techniques, we were able to find a way that someone could themselves get the same thought processes going that you would try to do in a motivational interview, and bring that out. And one of our co-authors was an author on that paper. And then the self-determination theory taxonomy is drawn from techniques used in self-determination theory interventions, targeting the basic psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And one of our co-authors, Marta Marquez, is an author on that one. And then my former PhD supervisor, Stan Maas, had published in 2005 a list of different self-regulation strategies. And so we knew that one and pulled that one in. And excuse me. Then the final one that we had was this Oxford Food and Beverage Taxonomy, which is probably the most detailed of any of the taxonomies that we included, but it's limited to dietary behavior change. And it has, so goal setting is broken down into many different facets of goal setting, and planning is broken down into many different facets, but not all of those are applicable when you're talking about behavior change more generally. So that's why we didn't include all of the studies, or that's why we didn't include all of the techniques from Oxfab. And also many of those are included in the BCTT V1, the Mickey taxonomy.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
But I found that one quite interesting because
Yeah.
it has a lot of really concrete examples and a lot of clear ways that those can be used.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe I think it should also be mentioned. You did not only look at the taxonomies, right, or this kind of list. You also did scoping reviews on 3 different fields. Which one was sports psychology, which of course I found like an obvious, interesting choice. Mm-hmm. Education. So you look at these different areas of work, which there is a lot of things done also in psychology, or all these. Human resources approach, human resources management, and these settings. So that was very interesting. I was wondering also, okay, as you said, I can imagine there was a lot of discussion because you had a lot of experts, I'm sure of, and they had, as you said, maybe they had different scopes of taxonomies, of techniques. They have different areas of application, I can imagine. I was wondering what kind of techniques were a bit more, contested in how to include them or whether to include them. For example, I like the fact that you do address that some techniques have adverse or kind of side effects or have had negative effects, right? You mentioned that, for example, in goal setting, which is, I think you say in your article, it's okay, it's a mild adverse effect. It's not that worrisome, let's say. But of course, there is, for example, pharmacological support, number 23, and I saw the definition, and I mean I agree that this is a self-enactable technique. I could see it that way, and it has adverse effects. But I also honestly read, especially thinking in my sports psychology experience, like oh yeah, steroids,
doping, yeah,
doping. It was this. I guess this was discussed, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that technique is already present in the behavior change techniques taxonomy V1. And yeah, of course, you don't want people to self-medicate without some sort of guidance or so, or without any sort of boundaries. So we made it clear that people should obviously get some professional advice before enacting any sort of pharmacological support on their own.
Yeah, and I don't know, I don't know if you will agree with this vision, but at least one of the things I learned with sports psychology is a lot about peak performance, high performance athletes, right? Olympic sports, and by definition, what I learned is that high performance sports, high performance especially. By definition is not healthy, not always healthy, or it could be, but a lot of it is driven by the competition and by all of these things. So it ends up sometimes sacrificing that part. But I mean, that was a different field, a different conversation anyway. Sports psychology is also exercise psychology and ends up being performance psychology. So a lot of aspects come into it. Another technique that I found very interesting, honestly, is actually the last one, 123, which is prayer. Because I mean, one can always see the connotations about it, but it is a technique and it is used a lot in all fields. Was that easy to come up?
This one definitely had a lot of debate, and when we had the review by experts in intervention development, there were some comments like, "Really, are we including this? Is this really the way forward?" And yeah, we couldn't ascribe it to any other technique. We couldn't lump it with anything else, but we could certainly see how someone might use it and feel more motivated, or maybe even change their behavior as a result of it. It's not based on any particular psychological theory, but it was something we uncovered in our review, and felt it okay to include, certainly.
Yes. Was there any other that you recall were also a bit discussed within the group, or that you found interesting, or maybe wanted to discuss more?
Some of the ones that were the most, so one of the trickiest parts of developing this compendium was to come up with examples for, we wanted the examples to be instructive and to have a member of the general public who reads it be reasonably able to self-enact the technique based on reading that definition. And it's not always fully clear whether they actually can. We didn't do any tests, but we will be able to, hopefully, if we get this additional funding that we've applied for, to turn the compendium into an app. But some of the ones that were the most difficult to create these examples for were sort of the classical conditioning type techniques. Can you classically condition yourself basically to change behavior? And we really struggled and worked a lot of hours just to come up with the examples that are there present in the compendium. So that was a real challenge. And yeah, several techniques we eliminated because we simply could not come up with a clear example of how somebody would be able to self-enact. And
is there a list of the ones you eliminated somewhere? Yeah, right.
There is a list. Yes,
I'm not sure
it's available in our OSF page.
Okay.
In supplementary file.
Yeah. No, maybe I have seen it. Maybe I was just I probably did not have it in my mind. Yeah, but that would be important, right? Because definitely the areas of application. Sometimes it's a bit tricky to convey it in this kind of a general compendium, right?
Yeah, supplementary file 4 contains the earlier version of the compendium before we eliminated all of the
Nice, thanks.
left out ones.
Yeah. Now I also wanted to address also something you already said a bit, which was about, okay, when you use this first version or working in progress version of the compendium for interviews with individuals, just to see how they will understand or not the descriptions and all of it. What was your feeling of, what do you think explains this kind of gap of that some people sometimes were not able to grasp it? What is it? And I say it in two ways, right? Is it more that science and scientists are so used to these terminologies that it's difficult to put them to the general public? Or do you also recognize that, we were never trained formally in behavior change at school or something like that? Like how do you explain this gap?
Yeah, a lot of it was down to terminology used, like that difficult words were used. Hold on a second. A lot of it was down to different terminology that was used and different difficult words that people weren't fully familiar with. And also, in academia and academic writing, we tend to use longer sentences and with different sub clauses, and we think that that's a clear way of communicating, but it's really not. And one thing that I think greatly improved all of the examples was to use this Shakespeare tool. I think it's called Shakespeare.
Oh yeah, I remember
exactly what it was called, but basically you just put your text in there and it shows you difficult sentences and shows you the reading level, and then you can just edit it until it becomes more readable, basically just by shortening the sentences, having fewer dependent clauses, and just eliminating as much unnecessary stuff as possible. And that, I think, was good. We didn't do any tests after that to see whether there had actually been an improvement in the examples, but I think there are. At least to me, reading them, they do seem more clear and simple as a result of that editing process.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's in your article that you described several steps that to kind of see what you were describing and how, I mean, the three aspects, especially that you measure also in the evaluation about coherence or congruence, rather, and just how people were really understanding and seeing this as useful, or how easy they were to self-enact, right? I think that was a key point. And I agree, yeah, some of the techniques do seem a bit like more requiring more effort, at least for someone who's not that experienced in this kind of engagement. But no, I found it was a very interesting work, like I said before. One of the last things I would like to ask you is, you already mentioned the further development and that you are applying for funding just to continue with it. Is there something that you could say about what kind of work will be needed, or you're planning to kind of develop this again?
Yeah, we have. So the main part would be to get this sort of self-guided version of the compendium. So the first step would just be to create for as many of the techniques as possible, some sort of digital tool to allow the person to self-enact the technique. So in some cases, it might be just the example present in the compendium tailored to whatever behavior they've decided to change. And that's an important first step. Is currently the examples contain different health behavior change targets. So some are about physical activity, some are about diet, some are about sleep. So to have a more comprehensive, so for every technique to have a way that the person might be able to target a particular behavior. So currently that matrix is only about half full, if that.
Yeah.
So we've implemented this crowdsourcing tool where people can offer new examples for new behaviors. So if a technique in the compendium only targets physical activity, someone can add one for diet if they want, and then we review those and update them periodically. To be honest, we haven't had many contributions so far, but a few.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so that would be a first step, is to make it more comprehensive, to give people more options. And then the next thing would be to map these techniques onto something like theoretical domains framework, which would allow us to identify if the person is low in self-efficacy, then okay, maybe you can try these techniques. Or if the person has social norms that are not congruent with the conducting of the behavior, then we can send them to these techniques. So a little bit of tailoring to guide people through.
Yeah, and
would be another addition.
I mean, I found it very interesting that, and you mentioned explicitly this also in the article about technology and the possibilities to do with technology. I think that's also what you're already planning to do, right? So, I mean, there is definitely, is this, what do you think is the role of technology? Because in this sense, you do address it also even in the descriptions. They are sometimes implied or sometimes more explicit. You know, there are some things, some of the techniques can be just done, okay, just sitting and thinking about stuff, or reflection, but others can be written as lists, like to-do lists or things like that. And others, like biofeedback, for example, of course, require technological devices. And so is this the direction that you would like to reach out in the end, to have this kind of technological support for this kind of self-enaction?
Well, yeah, where it's possible, sure. I think that, you know, providing everybody with a biofeedback device might not be usable, but if somebody already has a heart rate monitor on their watch, then maybe they can have a plugin which would allow that data to be synced. That's kind of advanced, and I think for this first round of funding, I don't think we'll get quite there, but it's a possibility for the future.
Yeah, and the other one you also pointed out also in your article, right? I mean, you reference, of course, the work that is being done about the development of ontologies, and I think there is a lot of also work already advancing towards putting psychological theories, for example, in kind of mathematical computational form, or just ontologies as a set of knowledge that really points out what are the parameters of effectiveness, what goes where. I mean, that's also that in essence the taxonomies were pointing at, right? And I guess that could also be a contribution of your compendium.
I'm not sure whether the compendium lends itself to that. I think that within the work on the compendium, or not the compendium, but the ontology of behavior changes, is to try and, you know, specify everything to in the most minute detail. And I think that there's certainly merit in that from a scientific point of view, but whether it helps the average person change their behavior, I don't see the direct link. Of course, to build the evidence base, to have a clear specification of what works for what person and for what behavior and when and how and all of these things, yeah, you need to be able to specify these things. But at the same time, that, you know, behavior change interventions started as a counselor, somebody talking to someone, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, having a chat with someone about how to change a dysfunctional behavior, or how to change the behavior to achieve some sort of health goal. Okay. Then there was someone would receive cognitive behavioral therapy, and that could contain any number of different behavior change techniques. There was sort of a black box.
Yeah.
And you'd compare people who received this black box intervention to people who received no intervention, and you say, oh yeah, black box is better than no intervention. So, okay. Then you'd have another group which also tests cognitive behavioral therapy, and their black box looks on the inside completely different than the other black box. Even though they're both called black box cognitive behavioral therapy, this one contains different ingredients than this one. So a taxonomy is really important in that, in getting the names right to try and establish this evidence base. But so much now is being delivered through apps, and you can clearly now name what it is, and you can track how often and when and in what situations people are actually using and enacting these techniques. And that type of data, I think, is more important in promoting behavior change in the long term for more people than really trying to identify all of the relationships and the evidence between modes of delivery, between mechanisms of action, between techniques themselves. It's very important scientifically, but when it comes to changing behavior currently, I think that we can gather a lot of individual data about how people use different behavior change techniques and in what settings and how effective those are. And if we can gather that type of data from hundreds of thousands of people, then that's an evidence base in itself. And it's very much hopefully helping people at the same time. So to me, I think that's a very interesting way to go in getting this individual data on what people are doing and trying to draw conclusions about effectiveness that way.
Well, then thank you. And just last couple questions, more practical and very short questions. For psychologists, for behavioral scientists, what are kind of the takeaways that you will say now about the article, about this compendium? How would you recommend them to, hey, use it this way for your research? It's mentioned a bit in your article, but maybe something has changed. I don't know. What would you recommend to researchers?
So if you're, say, if you're a counselor or a psychologist of some type or some community worker, and you're asking people to set goals, you should check what's in the compendium about goal setting and try to identify what the person themselves who's trying to change their behavior needs to do after they leave the conversation with you, because that what they actually do will indicate whether they succeed or not. So understanding that when you're trying to help someone change behavior, it's not just what you do, it's what you do to get that person to do the things that are needed to change the behavior. So focusing on that and understanding what it takes for an individual to change their behavior is the biggest takeaway in my view at this point.
Okay, thanks. And finally, so takeaway then for the general public, for lay persons. I mean, you already mentioned the crowdsourcing platform. I guess that's still active. Maybe that's a way that people might still contribute if they want to. But what's your general message for anybody who maybe gets access and sees this list of this compendium?
Yeah, have fun with it. Behavior change is not always easy, and in order to succeed, you need to have tools at your disposal. And this is one tool that you can maybe get some new ideas of how you can change your behavior. We don't know exactly which ones are going to be the most effective, and we don't know for each individual which ones are going to be the most effective, but it gives you some things you can try and gives you some things you can try to see whether you like them, whether they work for you. And if not, there's 123 in the list. So hopefully you'll find something that does work for you.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you again for the interview, for your time. I was sure that there's a lot to discuss about this, and I think you can always continue discussing. But yeah, really, thank you for taking the time at least to discuss a few things about it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah.
So that was my conversation with researcher Keegan Knittle. I hope you got to enjoy it as much as I did. And as usual, if you would like to read about the same type of content or just listen to it, just check the description below and you can see the link to my podcast or to my blog, and just check in all related content in my social network. As usual also, I will be happy to know what you think and what you thought about this conversation and about the compendium itself. Just feel free to drop any questions, any comments that you have. And if you like this type of content, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and like I said before, just follow me on social media. So remember, again, Self-Primacy, this channel is about learning, it's about practicing, it's about mastering, and also about sharing techniques and strategies that you can use to exert control over your own behavior. So, thank you for your attention and see you next time.